So hello and welcome to Ewe Sew You. This week we are in my chaotic kitchen and we're going to try a little bit of acid dyeing. So grab a rope, put your feet up and let's get going. Okay, so I've done a little bit of dyeing before with Kool-Aid, but this week we're having to go with proper acid dyes. So yeah, welcome to the kitchen. It's a tiny little space, so we'll see how we get on. I bought a kit for starting dyeing with acid dyes. I had a look around, saw what I could get. Various kits. Some of them you have like loads of different colours, plus beakers and mixers and pH strips and that kind of thing. Others you have a single skein and a couple of dyes. I went with an option from Wing and Woolworks, which I bought Fibre from before for spinning and things, simply because their kit included both skeins of yarn and fibre, so I didn't have to choose between the two for which to try out things on. But like I said, there are lots of kits out there, and you take your pick really. So Wing and Woolworks send you 4 colours based on what they've got in stock. They get something in the yellow family, the red family, the blue family and the green family. But it does depend on what they've got in. They use Colourcraft dyes, which are landscape dyes. So the first colour they've sent me is Wattle, which looks quite orange in the powder, but I'll put up on screen the sample swatch that you see on the website. It's actually quite a bright yellow. Then we have Desert Pea, which obviously in the jar looks quite dark and deep and maroony, but is a quite lipsticky red in the swatch. Next we have Mint, so again quite a dark powder but quite a bright vibrant green. And we have Lagoon, which looks kind of tealy in the powder and is quite a turquoise blue in the swatch. So those are the colours I'm working with. I've got 2 50-gram bumps of Polworth and Nylon fibre, and I've got 2 100-gram skeins of Merino. They're all superwash. So yes, you get quite a bit of yarn to try things out compared to some of the other starter kits. So yeah, not sponsored, just quite pleased with how much you get. They also included a pair of latex gloves, or non-latex gloves. These things, so that you can avoid getting stuff on your skin. I've also picked up a few other bits because you don't want to be using your kitchen equipment with your dyes. So I've picked up some of the big catering, I'll pick up 2 catering pans. My goal is to be able to dye up sweater quantities for myself. It's my short-term goal. So I bought a couple of those because that should give me enough space to do that. Bought myself a pair of dedicated dyeing tongs, some measuring spoons, and some of the cutest little beakers. Probably not quite big enough for big quantities, but they should suit me for now. I already had some citric acid left over from making bath bombs, and I've also picked up masks, like proper masks as opposed to my homemade wear in public masks, because although acid dye is not toxic as such, you don't really want to be breathing in powders for anything. So whilst everything's in powder form, I'll be wearing the mask. Probably take it off when it's no longer in powder form. There's probably not going to be a great deal of to-camera talking in this video. Probably do some kind of music or voiceover or something. We'll see how it goes. I'm going to shift the camera around to get a better angle of the pan, and we're going to start dyeing up the Polworth. Okay, so I'm going to try not to ramble too much with this voiceover, but hopefully it'll give you a bit of a sense of what I'm doing. Now I'm having a go at low immersion dyeing, at least I think that's what they call it. So I'm putting some water into my steam pan, my catering pan, to begin with, and I'm actually measuring out and jotting down how much I'm using. You'll see me jotting things down throughout the process. This is more so that I can scale up when I'm putting larger amounts of fibre or yarn or whatever in for future batches. I'm going to add a bit of citric acid to my water, I'm not entirely sure that this was necessary. I've heard somewhere that the dyes I was using has citric acid in already, but my water is hard water, so it's a bit alkali. I'm in a lime area, so better safe than sorry, quite frankly. So I'm going to dissolve that a bit into the water. The water is cold at this point. Again, I'm jotting down how much citric acid I've used. And next we're going to attempt to put on a glove to protect my skin from the dyes. The gloves that came in my kit are a bit small for me, so I will be investing in a larger stash of gloves for future dyeing. So I'm going to add a bit of the wattle to the water and mix that in. I just want a hint of yellow in the water, not like a strong colour. Because this is the pan I'm going to be dyeing the fibre in, I don't want to be moving fibre around too much in water because I don't want to felt it. I want to be able to spin it later. So I thought if I put some colour in the water first, then the underside is definitely getting some colour added to it, even if it's not as much as the top side. So I've got in my other pan my fibre and my yarn soaking, again just in water, no citric acid or anything added into it. So I'm going to squeeze it out a bit and lay it into the slightly yellow water. If I'd thought about it, I would have made sure that the bits that sort of curl back on themselves were not in the same place, just to give a bit more room in the pan, but there we go. A gentle smush into the water and jot down what I've done. So yeah, the yarn is still soaking in that other pan. I'll get to that in a bit. My next step was to try mixing up some of the dyes in water. So I'm going to jot down how much dye to how much water I'm using to create my recipe. And we're going to be doing some red first. So the desert pea. So yeah, just making my notes as I go, managing not to put any dye on the book, which is nothing short of miraculous, quite frankly. And we're going to start by pouring a few stripes of the desert pea across the fibre. I'm going to take kind of like a striped approach to dyeing this, mostly to keep the balance of colours as even as I can. I'm just going to gently smush without agitating the fibre, just to help that colour get a bit further through the fibre before I move on to the next one. I want to get as much penetration as I can with that colour so that I've got as few white spaces as possible. I don't mind a few, I don't want that many. So moving on to the mint dye, and I'm going to be adding stripes in between the desert pea ones. So again, I'm looking to get maximum coverage on this side of the fibre, making notes as I go to make sure that if I want to try and re-dye fibre in the same way, I can. Now, I know this mint does look kind of blue as it goes on. It is green, promise. But yeah, it looks kind of blue in the dye form, which is it's kind of interesting. So yeah, so that's the mint gone on, making my notes, and I'm going to give it another gentle smush before I go in with my next colour, which will be the lagoon. So the lagoon is going to be targeting the spaces between the desert pea and the mint stripe, so you can kind of see them white in the frame at the moment. You can probably also see towards the far end of the pan, next to where my notepad is, there's a bit of pool of dye forming. That's because there's not as much fibre at that end of the pan, so there's more liquid there, more water there for the dye to come into. You'll also probably notice I'm using kitchen towel and rinsing out my cups and things between colours because I don't want to contaminate between dyes as I'm going. I want to keep the colours as clear as possible and have them blend in the pan rather than in my jugs. So here we're pressing that lagoon dye, ready to go onto the fibre. Now, incidentally, this footage is sped up about 300%, so it's much faster than it was in actuality. But yeah, so you can see there's not a huge amount of difference in the liquid form of this lagoon dye to the mint dye, and I was at this point wondering whether the mint would turn out green. It did, but spoiler alert, So yeah, there is a bit of a difference, and they are blending a little bit. We're starting to see a few purple tones coming out as well as the blue is bleeding into the Desert Pea. So yeah, a little bit of a clean of the gloves as I've been smushing down, clean out the Vickers, and I wanted to do something about the few white spots that are hovering around, mostly towards the edges of the pan to be fair, but there's a couple in between the stripes as well. So I'm giving everything a quick clean and mixing up some of the wattle, that yellow dye, ready to fill in those blank spaces. So, incidentally, the measuring spoons that I'm using, these metal measuring spoons, were bought specifically for dyeing with. They're not expensive. And the little beakers were also bought specifically for dyeing with. If I do decide to scale up, I will need bigger beakers because these are tiny. So there we are, just spreading that wattle out over the emptier spaces to get as much coverage as I can. I'm not worrying too much if there's a couple of little white spaces, but I just want the bulk bit done. Moving on to the yarn. So the back of the stove underneath where my yarn is resting there, I've got that fibre just sitting in the water that you've just seen me dye it with, and waiting for me to be ready to do the next step. I just wanted it to settle and sit for a bit and let the dyes do their thing. So that's it whilst I dyed up the yarn. So the yarn is Superwash Merino. Again, I'm putting water in first. I'm not putting any citric acid in at this stage because the yarn I can move around without worrying about felting it, as it's a Superwash Merino and it's in yarn form already rather than in fibre form. So yeah, on with the mask because we're dealing with powders. I'm attempting to put the glove on. This did not go well. My fingers did not reach the end of the fingers in the glove. It was a pain, and it made the dyeing technique that I'm using for the yarn ever so awkward. So yeah, so definitely looking for some bigger gloves next time. Blowing into the glove didn't really help much, but we got it on enough for me not to stain my fingers. Now I've attached my yarn to some reusable zip ties. That's going to help me lift the yarn up without tangling it and without burning my fingers later, which is always a bonus. Okay, so just make sure it's all spread out in the van. I've only got 2 skeins in here. I can probably get 3, maybe 4 in there. I think next time around we'll see. So yeah, so we're going to actually do some speckling for this yarn. So we're starting with the wattle and just putting a few pinches of the wattle across the entire length of that upside of the yarn. So I'm not looking for total coverage, I'm just looking for an even spread of speckles. So that's the dry powder going onto the damp yarn that's sitting in a small amount of water. So then we're going to do the same with the Desert Pea. So we're looking for an even spread. And I was really struggling to do this because, as I say, my fingers were not to the end of the fingers in the gloves. So this was awkward. Now to resolve that, as I moved on to the Lagoon dye, I actually changed the way I did my speckling. Very simply, I took one of my measuring spoons and I used that. So I put some dye in the measuring spoon and then tapped it as I spread it over the whole length of the yarn. Again, I'm looking for an even spread of speckles rather than full coverage. So once I've got that even spread of speckles, I'm just going to leave that to sit for, I think it was about 5 minutes I left for. And she says, checking her notes, yes, 5 minutes I let it sit for, just to allow that dye to start to penetrate the yarn. So the mask is going back on for 5 minutes and I'm going to turn the yarn over. So as I'm doing so, the speckles are starting to spread, the dye starting to move as it hits the water. So that's going to cause a bit more coverage across the yarn without getting rid of the speckly feel. So it's both skeins flipped over and popped back in. Spread out with my tongs that again bought specifically for dyeing. Do not use your kitchen utensils to dye anything with unless you're using food colouring. So making notes of what I've done all the time. Looking back to where I was before, I'm going back to the wattled, that yellow dye, and I'm speckling all over this newly revealed side of the yarn. I mean, you can still see that there's been some penetration of that lagoon in particular shown on the camera. There were also yellow and red spots as well visible as I was working on this side. So I was just making sure there was an even spread of the wattle, and again with the desert pea, making sure there's an even spread of that colour across the side that is now uppermost of that yarn. And again, awkward using the gloves that don't fit, but I wanted to do the same on the front as the back. So by sticking to the pinch for the ones that I pinched, I was able to get that consistency there. Now we're going to go in with the mint this time. So we use Lagoon on the first side, we're using mint on the second side, just to make sure we've got the variation of colour in. Again, I'm looking for an even spread of speckles, and I'm using the spoon technique again. And again, I'm going to allow that to sit for 5 minutes before moving on to the next step. And I'm not going to be using any more powdered dye for this session. So the mask is off. Somehow I managed to get dye on my face. Don't do that. It came off easily, but still, don't do that. So now we're going to add some citric acid to the yarn. So I'm actually putting it into a beaker so that I can measure how much citric acid to water I'm adding in. Mixing it in with a bit of water to make sure it dissolves. I don't want to have citric acid granules on the yarn. I don't think it would make any difference in the grand scheme of things, but again, it's better safe than sorry. So I'm just topping up that tray with some more water. Again, I do need to get some big beakers for dyeing, particularly if I'm going to dye any form of larger quantity, like for a sweater or something. So we are nearing the end of the process. I'm just still assessing how much water is in there, if I need any more. I decided I did need a little more, added that in, and made a note of how much water I've added to the pan ahead of the next step. And as I did for the yarn pan, I'm adding more water to the fibre pan. So I'm actually adding, I believe, the same amount as I added to the yarn. Yeah, I'm just checking my notes here. Yeah, the exact same amount was added to both pans, ready for this final step, which is to heat the fibre and the yarn. So after it had steamed away for a while, this is what both pans looked like. They had about half an hour heating up, probably about 40 minutes in the end, by the time I got back to it. So there's the fibre looking nicely tie-dyed, even though it wasn't tie-dyed. You see the green starting to come through, and then the yarn at the front. So having steamed it, I've let it sit and come down to room temperature on its own, and it looked like this, ready to be hung up and dried. So yeah, that's always an interesting moment, waiting for yarn to dry, see what it looks like in its final form. Okay, so here's the finished results for the Polworth fibre. So we've got some nice bold tones in there. A little bit of purple where some of the dyes are mixed, which is fine. I like purple. So lots of yellows, lots of oranges, good splash of bluey green. They're both fairly similar. There are a few patches of white where the dye hasn't quite penetrated the fibre, but I'm okay with that. And we'll see as this spins up, the colours are going to blend together. It'll be interesting to see how that turns out. And the yarn, you see the speckles have spread out a bit. It's still got a speckly feel, but there's a bit more coverage than just where the speckles landed as they were sprinkled, so that's nice. We've got some paler sections with more of the sort of bluey green tones, and then again we've got these sort of autumnal rich oranges throughout as well. So next steps, first up I'm going to wind up one of these skeins and knit a swatch so I can see how it knits up. Also going to start spinning up one of these braids and see how that spins up. Following that, I need to get some more bare yarn. So same base as this, and see if I can replicate that colourway, because I'm thinking, depending on how it knits up, if it knits up in a way that I like for a garment, this may be a garment knit. So I'm quite pleased with how that's turned out. I think it's not a bad colour for me. So yeah, I just want to see if I can replicate that to get us a better quantity and knit up a cardigan or something. So hopefully by the end of August I have a swatch knit up in this yarn to show you how it's working up, and also started to spin with this fibre to see how that's going. So I'll be able to show you those when I do that video. I'd love to see you in next week's video as well, but until then, there's another video here on the screen that you might be interested whilst you're waiting. In the meantime, happy crafting and bye-bye for now.